Welcome back, and thanks for joining me for part 2 of Jacques Attali's Brief History of the Future. If you missed part 1, I put a link in the description below. You can go watch that one first if you wish. But for a brief recap, it was Attali's telling of the history of capitalism and its use of freedoms and democracy to remove all barriers to capitalism, leading to the crazy shit we see today, like rejecting biological sex so that one can purchase one's own identity. I'm sure I sound like a broken record, but I promise it becomes very relevant as we now get into Jacques Attali's predictions of our dystopian future. We left off with Attali telling us that there has been 8 preceding forms. And so after introducing California as the 9th form, he says the end of this form is here. He essentially spends 4 pages saying that our current economic and political system is unsustainable, which is not only obvious, but he wants to make it clear. You see, you cannot have a great reset if everybody wants to keep it as is, maintain the status quo. You need to inception people into wanting it. This isn't happening yet. He says LA will go strong until about 2030. And so chapter 3 is where he begins these future predictions that are to take place in this current form in California up to the year 2030. He speaks of the marketing of time, which apparently is the next item that is going to be mass-produced. He says it will become harder to discern difference between work, consumption, transport, entertainment, and training. Consumer products will be made to measure. I think we're starting to see this now. He says they will continue creating conditions for increasingly solitary urban living and smaller apartments. Think of tiny living, living in the pods, austerity where there are apartments that are like 400 square feet in New York and places like that. He says we will have increasingly fleeting sexual or romantic partners. It seems like the more sexual freedom we have, the more solitary and less sex people are having. He says pedophilia and sodomy are going to become normalized. And we're going to have virtual communities. And we're there now. After forcing us into mega cities, we will have to use public transportation and spend more time on travel and commuting. You will have to travel to stay employed, and considering the shit they tried to pull with the vax passports, you can imagine how this is going to end. Now, to counter this, during COVID, they wanted to restrict travel and do everything via Zoom and Teams, etc. They're saying you can see the difference in the environment and whatnot. So there might be a dialectic at play here between making it easy to work from home and restrict travel, and what he predicts that you have to travel to stay employed. I don't think both can be true, but I can validate that they are building high rises on public transit lines with all the shopping on the bottom floors so no one needs cars. I've worked on these projects personally. Perhaps after getting everyone out of cars with the luxury of working from home and all that's left is public transit, then they can pull the rug out, so to speak, and you'll have to travel into the heart of the city for work, perhaps. He talks of pilotless, cheap collective vehicles. Now, if you go to some of the major liberal cities, you will see tons of scooters just laying all over the place that have like an Apple Pay reader on them to use. When you're done, you just leave them lay wherever for the next person to grab. They're like communal. He says the bulk of your income will be used for the purchases of services. Notice the key words subscribers and service, as in you'll own nothing and be happy. The 2 dominant industries are going to be entertainment and insurance. The media will have a greater hold over democracy and over our choices. This should be extremely obvious by now. We get into nomadic ubiquity. He says before 2030, everyone will be connected to the grid. I think this is what 5G is about and will lead to smart cities. He gets into that in a bit. The point is to get everyone connected to everything by all of their devices at all times, sort of a collective global brain. He says this leads to better management. This leads to making our nomadic objects lighter and smaller. Notice he is describing the iPhone and iWatch and the iPad and how these connect to Fitbits and stuff, your iWallet. He says you're going to have personalized search engines like Alexa or Siri. Our entertainment will also be personalized or made to measure, as he puts it. Again, like a service subscription-based, also entertainment like YouTube channels and vloggers and podcasts, and be able to watch them on our phones or watches and etc. Remember, YouTube just started about a year or two before he actually wrote this, and he has already could predict its massive role and its impact. Now, none of this is groundbreaking since these were all in the works when he wrote this, but he is going to tell us the why, which is probably more important. My own personal interpretation for all this is that this further leads into extreme individualism by playing on narcissism and egotism. We already have the creators of Facebook apologizing for ripping society apart. By 2030, games will be more about creating, imagining, informing, teaching, and what's that? Surveillance. Your games are going to spy on you. So now we're starting to get the point here. Does anybody remember the thing with the Pokemon Go? He says eventually we're going to get 3D movies with smell-o-vision. He says, and this is interesting, we're going to get domestic robots. They will be connected to the grid and they will become watchers. Oh yes, robots that help you but also spy on you. Now, why do you think they started with something simple like Alexa in your house? And if you've been paying attention, they've started to put this in movies. There's a kids movie that just came out called Ron's Gone Wrong. And just guess what the plot of that one is. Not only will you be monitored through your devices, food packaging, clothing, vehicles, household goods, and appliances will become communicative. Everything will be censored. Products, machines, and people. People will be equipped with an identity tag, like RFID. We're going to be putting a lot into the Alex Jones tip jar in this episode. And we're going to keep getting all this tracking in the name of convenience. And what is this all for? Read the underlined sentence. By 2030, this will reverse course and become hyper surveillance. This is the tech the next form will be built around. Remember his keys to forms from earlier. They are always built around new tech advances that create mass products out of services. Are you the next mass-produced good? Next, he's going to talk about the aging of the world. Life expectancy shall improve, but most important, the birth rates are dropping. And what is contributing to that? Oh yes, freedoms of women. Birth rates will drop below replacement level and cause reduction in population, just as they have planned. And speaking of population reduction, he says the lack of children allows women to escape male domination and pushed into society. In other words, to create massive changes like discussed in Changing Images of Man, makes sense to flood positions with women. I've read studies that show that women are way more subject to propaganda and tend to be more liberal. Also, the more kids women have, the more conservative they become. Obviously, can't have that if you want a great reset. Also, notice the desired effect on the Muslim populations. This is racist, right? He says we're going to have more old people, and the more old people drive up medical expenses, which drives up insurance, and with less youth to foot the bill, guess what's needed? You guessed it, mass immigration of the third world to replace the native aging population. Tell me you haven't read countless stories justifying this and Vox and shit like that, as if it wasn't the plan from the get-go. Mass immigration means more urban growth. We have to put these people somewhere. I've been in the construction industry for about 20 years, and I've always wondered why there are so many high-rises going up near mass public transit with like retail and gyms and shit at the bottom floors, all in these big cities that didn't justify the growth. And now it makes sense to me personally. They're building in anticipation of about 1 billion people migrating here in the next couple of decades. I'm sure you've heard by now, get the fuck out of cities ASAP. Speaking of, he's going to talk about tomorrow, the cities. He says nothing will be able to stop this mass migration. He says these major cities will be able to host over 10 million people each, and some up to 1 billion. I've heard characters like Glenn Beck in interviews saying we need like 1 billion people in the United States. At the time he wrote this, as you can see, he was already pointing out the mass immigration to the west, especially dealing with our border at the south. And this came more to a climax during the Trump campaign. And remember, we were told it was racist to notice, or we were conspiracy theorists. Yet, Attali here tells us it was coming by 2020. He even admits that there are 12 million here illegally at that time. But remember, that was just conspiracy. He says in 20 years, America will be less than 50% whites. Another conspiracy theory. He says this growth is necessary for the merchant order. Immigration is a tool of capital. If you do not understand that, you don't know shit. And if you're one of my environmental-minded leftist friends, then you should understand that studies have shown that mass migration to the West is very bad for the environment. This is happening in Western Europe as well in full force since this was written, and it was sold as necessary for the economy to work. Of course, because capitalism needs infinite growth. He says this flow of immigration will hurt the middle working classes. Again, another conspiracy theory. And to my climate change friends out there, you cannot be for mass migration to industrialized countries and also for limited growth in green energies. Mass immigration creates more pollution and more consumption of natural resources, studies have shown. Which is a great segue to the next section, scarcity. More consumers leads to more scarcity. This will create a situation to replace actual movement with telecommunications, like Zoom and Teams and working from home. Almost like he predicted this. But again, this contradicts what he just said earlier, that everybody's going to have to travel to stay employed. He says lack of food is the reason for the fake meat and GMOs, which he even admits here aren't harmless. And after about 2 pages of climate change fear porn, we get into this prediction that, again, of mass migration due to climate issues, climate migrants. We're already seeing the propaganda about climate refugees that need to come here. Now, this one about Africa got me thinking. Earlier, he describes how resource-rich Africa is, but how no one can extract it due to how unstable the continent is. Now, here he says like 3/4 of the Africans will be moved to the West. That's a lot of people. Now, this is 100% speculation here, but how much of this can we speculate is terraforming? They already have admitted since the 70s that they have the power to control weather. So is climate change sort of a cover for controlled, weaponized weather modification? They can move mass amounts of people from their homeland due to climate change and make it easier to swoop in and extract resources on empty land. Speculating, but something to think about. Now we get back to this theme of time, which he says is the only true scarcity. Time is scarce because you will waste so much of it on transportation and work, hence the need for nomadic devices as discussed earlier. This wasted time eats into your time to consume, hence the need for nomadic devices that allow you to consume one's physical materials virtually. Time is another constraint that we must get free from. So we come to the fate of this ninth form. How will the form in LA end? And right off the bat, he contradicts himself and lies. The first major crisis, the housing bubble, was caused because low wages, quote, forced the middle class to go into debt to purchase their homes, end quote. Fucker literally just said a few pages ago in the history of capitalism that the middle class saved and not consumed until marketing admin like Bernays and such convinced everyone to go into debt to consume. Then he admits the, quote, initiated gambled with your debt and made a fortune without any risk to themselves. And of course, as is always the case, the crisis they engineered is used as a pretext to consolidate control even more into their hands, to implement some international regulatory institution, kicking out Wall Street, he says. Sounds like a great reset to me, huh? Then we have another trope admitted. Wages are in decline due to immigration and outsourcing of jobs. Now remember when Trump said that, he was given Pinocchios by the media, and Snopes debunked that. He says up until 2030, growth will be underwritten by debts as long as the military protects these markets. This will eventually lead to its decline, and what's that? Replacement. He says the internet ends up becoming sovereign without borders. This is what will challenge America's power. This allows big tech to detach itself from America, no longer use the universities and hospitals for research and development, which has been the staple since World War I. Will start to be controlled by foreign investments. Profits accumulate in tax havens, of course, as is the norm. This obviously reduces America's incoming taxes. There will be a middle-class revolt, and communities will break down. Check. Essentially, economic collapse is inevitable by 2030, and we could then become a social democracy and or a full-on dictatorship. Essentially says fascism was able to emerge from this type of crash the last time. He asks the question, is a 10th form possible? He says this new form will be like its predecessors, extend even more freedoms of lifestyles, giving more choices to consumers at the cost of alienating workers. They need to reduce the cost of services again and introduce new consumer products. He says this new core probably remains in California and names La Jolla, whatever it's pronounced, which is like Spooksville, and home to transhumanism and nanotech. He says eventually we will get to a point where this merchant order does not need a physical location for its core. He says once the market is powerful enough and the cost of data exchange is low enough to where this innovative class doesn't need to live in the same place to, quote, rule the world. Mask off. So he's taken us up to about 2030, and he says as the ninth form of LA fades, it will give way to a masterless, polycentric world that will not last. By 2050, the market will become planetary and stateless. We will have super empire that deconstructs public services, then sovereign states, then nations. This super empire will share the core of LA's values. He says democratic nations must help spread market democracies to China and the Muslim world and Africa with the use of newspapers, radios, new elites, and NGOs. This could create hundreds of new artificial states like we did before. the mercantile order will organize itself in juxtaposition of market democracies. That's an interesting phrase. Since this is translated from French, it is hard to decipher, does he mean it in contrast as in dialectic, or in comparison to show similarities? Either way, they will create a polycentric world with many powers. He says these nations are the mistresses of the polycentric order and will constitute an informal world government. And who are these? The Security Council, the G8, the WEC, Davos, etc. This is extremely obvious. And if you recall episode 1, they realized a central world government cannot work, and they used the spin model, hence the polycentric world, and the use of G8 Davos types. He says even this won't be able to stand up to the market. Everything in the public sector will be consumed by market forces and become wage slaves of the private sector. We are seeing this in the health industry for sure, and I remember the Dr. Day tapes, him making such a prediction. This leads to replacing public services with mass-produced objects, which, as we are about to find out, leads us into hyper-surveillance by these new mass-produced objects. And that brings us to his next section, the object as substitute for the state, from hyper-surveillance to self-surveillance. The market will profit from what are now public services like education, health, environment, police, etc. These will be commercialized and then replaced with mass-produced consumer objects, which fits into our present axiom of technical progress as a good. New nanotech allowing the storage of energy on nanometric entities. This is why La Jolla is the best guess for the new core since it is home of nano and biotech. New microprocessors will use DNA. Autoresponders will be capable of replicating and repairing themselves. The purpose of this is to use much less energy for production. He says nomadic objects, including prosthesis, will miniaturize the means of info in entertainment and communication and transportation and will be integrated one way or another into the body. This tip jar is filling up really quick. The old conspiracy theory that the only way to enter stores or buy food or take transportation or buy anything will be from something implanted in the body is what Attali here is telling you is coming. He says it will serve as a sensor and a controller. He says your clothes will be linked to these objects. On top of that, we're going to get some personal robots, self-steering cars, and companies will send tourists to the moon and to Mars. Now we're up to about 2040, and he says that the markets will reduce the state to zero and destroy the polycentric order they earlier established. New objects acting as the engine of growth will be surveillance objects that replace traditionally state-run functions, as mentioned earlier, including education, health, sovereignty. He calls them the Watchers. This, of course, will radically modify relations with the individual, identity, life, sovereignty, knowledge, power, nation, culture, geopolitics. Remember when, in Changing Images of Man, they said they had to radically alter our image of man to prep for this coming age. He says this will go through two stages, hypersurveillance and then self-surveillance. These public services will be privatized. Private security and private police will spy on you for insurance and corporations. Once everything gets transferred to the private sector, and what was once public works paid for with tax revenue is now privatized, you'll have to pay for everything. This also means they will own and control all the resources. This allows for the complete tracking and tracing of everything you do and hyper-surveillance. This allows for global corporations to replace the state. We will have to pay insurance to have access to what was once public services, which then allows for complete control of everything you do. Through surveillance, you have to conform to norms, or else they will just cut off your services. Now you get why we are having this fight over whether you can be fired or bank account closed or refuse service for not taking jabbies or saluting the rainbow flag, etc. This is part of the dialectic, and you can see that more than half the population is 100% on board with this. And so you don't think I'm exaggerating, I'll read directly, word for word, what he says. Quote, "This transfer to the private sector will gradually reduce public spending and help save on scarce resources. As we have already seen, it will become part and parcel of the host of services making it possible to track objects and people. Nomadic ubiquity opens itself to hypersurveillance when whoever is connected leaves traces of his passage. Private services will then manage social rights and the administrative services. In many places, the state is henceforth relieved of the burden of countless decisions entrusted to high independent authorities that relieve the state of all responsibility. To put it in different terms, in exchange for a tax cut that will above all benefit the wealthiest and penalize the poorest, we shall henceforth have to pay for public services. And since these competing private enterprises will have to spend considerable sums to attract clients, the service's final cost for the client will rise accordingly. Users, private individuals or businesses, will become consumers, obliged to pay directly for their services, whether in the form of a direct purchase from providers or else in the form of premiums paid to insurance companies, as a substitute for tax revenue, which will plummet. These insurance companies will demand not only that their clients pay their premiums to insure themselves against sickness, joblessness, death, theft, fire, and security, but will also verify that their clients conform to norms to minimize the risks they will be called on to cover. They will gradually come to dictate planetary norms, what to eat, what to know, how to drive, how to protect oneself, how to consume, how to produce. They will penalize smokers, drinkers, the obese, the unemployable, the inadequately protected, the aggressive, the careless, the clumsy, the absent-minded, the spendthrift. Ignorance, exposure to risk, wasting, and vulnerability will be considered diseases. Other businesses will also have to comply with norms in order to avoid industrial disasters, work accidents, or external aggression, and even the wastage of real resources. Businesses will have at once to respect the norms imposed on them by the insurance companies and in their turn require their collaborators, a part of whose contribution they will pay, to comply with other norms. This compliance will imply monitoring one's health, knowledge, vigilance, and property, being thrifty with rare resources, keeping an eye on one's health, training, and protecting oneself will become socially necessary behaviors. For the insurance companies to pay off economically, everyone, private individual or business, must therefore agree that a third party verify his conformity to the norms. For this, everyone must agree to be monitored. The era of Big Brother, earlier proclaimed but only partially implemented, will become the norm." End quote. So now do you understand the freak out over vaccine passports and the restriction of travel and shopping and just leaving your home if you do not conform to health norms like being forced to get the jabbies? You can see how COVID greatly advanced in this direction very quickly. We now understand the push to allow corporations and businesses to dictate to its employees social norms and health measurements. Self-surveillance. Now you understand the at-home COVID test and COVID tracking to prove that you are clean. This is why Attali said that the movie Blade Runner is the most accurate portrayal of our future. You're going to own nothing and be happy. The next section is surveillance, master word for the times ahead. He says sensors and cameras will be installed literally everywhere. I remember the head of the CIA, I forgot, Petraeus, I think, once was telling recruits that they would even have sensors in microwaves and like all household appliances. He says biometrics will be used for surveillance, also to monitor the body and again, health. They already have you conditioned for this with your Fitbits and your heart rate monitors and shit like that. And again, half the population already wants to force vaccine passports. And now you can see why the Rockefeller Foundation started, and now it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, why they're so heavily invested in health. It will be the means to gain control and spy on everyone. He says, quote, sensors and miniature cameras installed in all public and eventually private places, in offices and in recreational areas, and finally on the nomadic objects themselves, like your iPhone, will monitor all comings and goings. Well, he actually says the phone already allows us to communicate and be tracked. Biometric techniques, fingerprints, iris, shape of hands and face, will allow for surveillance of travelers, workers, and consumers. Countless analytical devices will make it possible to monitor the health of a body, a mind, or a product. The unique nomadic object will be permanently traceable. All the data it contains, including images of everyone's daily life, will be stored and sold to specialist businesses and to public and private police. Individual data on health and competence will be updated by private databases that will allow for predictive tests in view of preventative treatment. End quote. So all this data they collect on you by spying on you gets sold to corporations, which you already should know this part by now. But it is a means of predictive behavior. This is the purpose of game theory that was developed in World War II and all the way up through the Cold War, collecting mass amounts of data to predict behavior, which eventually leads to behavior control. I talked about this in my Changing Images of Man videos. He says nothing's going to be hidden anymore. He says after prisons are replaced with just house arrest, this leads to self-surveillance. This, of course, allows the market to make more mass-produced objects that allow for self-monitoring. Eventually, you will have electric bugs under your skin. He says, quote, electronic bugs worn subcutaneously will ceaselessly register heartbeat, blood pressure, and cholesterol. Microprocessors connected to various organs will watch their functioning as compared to the norms. Miniature cameras, electronic sensors, biomarkers, nanomotors, and nanotubes will give everyone the opportunity to measure permanently or periodically the parameters of his own body. This is the third time he tells you that they're going to implant shit in your body. And he says all this is sold as self-monitoring for, once again, health. But what's overlooked is the to conform part of this agreement. This is more and more looking like one of these Black Mirror episodes. He says surveillance becomes ubiquitous and nomadic. And so we went through an entire history of capitalism where at every stage it advanced hyper-individualism, each stage liberating you from constraints. This ultimate goal of unchecked individualism has led to nothing more than being controlled by global corporations spying on literally everything you do and imposing new norms on you. So once you got free from social norms and the family and your sex and your religion and all the other things that were constraints, this is what your future is going to look like. Attali says everyone will return with passion to these surveillance instruments. He says that fear of deterioration and growing familiarity with these nomadic instruments and mistrust of the medical and educational guilds. Notice the mistrust of medical and educational institutions being used as a dialectic, getting everyone to buy into this injecting monitors in the body. We are currently seeing faith in these institutions dropping almost as if it was done on purpose with how COVID was handled. He says insurance will require you to have these injected just to be covered. Remember, you need insurance to participate in the market to begin with. Once again, using norms to force compliance, or you just cannot participate. And again, you're seeing this kind of come into play now. And again, half the population is more than happy to kick you out of society for not conforming to these norms. He says everyone will now have become his own prison guard. And at the same time, individual freedom will have reached the mountaintop, the pinnacle, at least in the imagination, by the use of these new nomadic objects. He says these self-repairers will be the new thing. Notice he always tells you what conditioned you for this. They hope to unlock genetic behaviors under the guise of helping, as if this cannot be re-engineered for behavior control, as we have already seen. And now he's starting to talk briefly about transhumanism with connecting brains to computers. The next big phase is deconstruction of nation states. He says that corporations will use the media to orient citizens' choices. Yeah. The elite will no longer consider their country of origin or have any loyalties and will only locate where their states give them the best tax breaks and the best tax laws. Again, we're seeing that now. He says this means states will have to compete for these corporations. Quote, states will then compete with one another by announcing massive cuts in taxes on capital and on the innovative class, which will gradually deprive them of the bulk of their resources. Utterly drained and pushed as well by the appearance of self-surveillance devices, states will abandon to the market the task of proposing the bulk of services related to education, health, security, and even sovereignty. They will do it first by relocating public services to the countries with a low-cost labor force, and next by privatizing them. Then taxes will go down and the minimum wage statutes, as well as statutes for the protection of the weakest, will be swept away. Financial insecurity will become the rule for everyone. This is where the libertarians and the GOP anti-state right fail. The need for protections of citizens without a sovereign. Without a state or sovereign, you have zero protections from global corporations. Now, I'm not advocating or saying communism is the answer or correct. That is a dialectic, because the end result is withering away of the state too. But some of their critiques are correct. And libtards have no idea this is what's coming, and they love it. He says all of this will be at the expense of the worker in favor of the consumer. And this is part of the dialectic from the left, the push for equality, and now that word's changed to just be straight up equity. It's about getting everyone access to be consumers, which obviously, as we're seeing here, leads to being controlled, monitored, surveilled. And Attali even says here that the left and the right play into this dialectic. The right pushes for privatization while the left pushes for equality, which just means more consumers. And just reading through this, he seems to have done a pretty good job of predicting someone like Trump and populism. Obviously, him calling this a dictator is just histrionics. He actually admits that while Africa still struggles to catch up, that the West will descend into third world countries just like Africa. Once again, he says America will lose its sovereignty and deconstruct. He says it's the virtual world, the internet, that leads to its demise. He says people will even claim citizenship of the virtual world over like the USA. It's almost like he's kind of predicting what we're seeing roll out with Meta. And here at the bottom, he seems to be predicting a Trumpish type character. He says certain forces, especially military, will then attempt to restore the means of action of the federal state by nationalizing strategic businesses, closing the borders, and squaring up, if necessary, to former allies. But he says eventually Washington has to hand over complete political control to big corporations, and administrative services will all be privatized, which we are seeing happening right in front of our eyes this very day. So we're getting into the next section. Again, he's obsessed with this theme of time and nomadism. But he says here the freedom offered by the super empire is extremely alienating. Like, no shit. He says they will still use American model to impose on the world as every business enters the surveillance market. He says that any time not consuming is considered lost. He says, quote, the more solitary a man is, the more he will consume, and then he will monitor and distract himself in order to furnish his solitude. Individual freedom, constantly increased by self-monitoring, will lead everyone to consider himself responsible for his own private sphere, both professional and private, to obey only in appearance, only his own whim, and in reality, to comply with the norms, setting the requirements for his own survival. He goes on to say, while you are no longer bound by the social contract of society, you are now bound by the norms imposed by insurance companies. He says because everyone is atomized and self-monitored competitors, political change will be inconceivable. And so now you can kind of understand the goal of alienation and destruction of norms and family and the nation, identity, race, etc. He says this leads to parents no longer loving and raising their own kids who will grow up in solitude. These children of solitude will fill the voids with sex, drugs, and self-surveillance objects. He says self-surveillance will dress itself up as information, a game, or entertainment so you don't fear it or realize it's for your enslavement. Quote, to manage mercantile time, the two dominant industries will be insurance and distraction. Insurance companies will create private police forces that will first take care of hyper-surveillance of businesses, consumers, and workers. They will spend considerable sums to shape public opinion and gain the loyalty of their clients. They will require of them the obligation to respect the norms and then the purchase of self-surveillance items. In order not to seem reduced to fear management, self-surveillance will dress itself up as information, as a game, or as entertainment. What remains of politics will also become a pure stage-managed show put on by politicians, occasional players, and neglected performance. This is here. This is right now. He's literally describing everything that's going on right now with all the devices, TikTok and the Pokemon Go and fucking Biden, Trump, the whole thing. He's describing everything that's going on right now. Next, he's going to talk about nomadic businesses. He says the future of corporations is nomadic. Again, mentioning they will start to replace all the functions the state once offered. He says they will embody consumer values. People will only buy from the companies they politically agree with, which we've already seen this change. And, of course, they fund the NGOs, which this is old hat by now. He calls these nomadic corporations circuses, as in they will no longer stay in one place, but move around to offer their services. The way he describes them is just weird and probably only makes sense to him. But here he lists some pretty significant names, including AIG, Citigroup, Disney, Walmart, Microsoft, Boeing, and one in particular that popped was Bechtel, who we should know from the Changing Images of Man video. He says some of these will create their own points currency, which I think everybody kind of can already see this. Everywhere you shop offers you like rewards and points and cashback offers and all this stuff. I mean, we're being well conditioned for this. And of course, he says they will have more power than the state. He says if these insurance companies manage to control the leading businesses and impose their norms on the states, if these mercenaries replace armies, and if business currencies substitute themselves for leading world currencies, he says then the super empire will have won the day. And as I've said before, and to anyone I've ever talked to, these new norms that are being imposed aren't grassroots rejections of capitalism, a rejection of modernity, but they are in fact the norms that are imposed from the top down. He then goes on to describe what he calls pirate businesses that, because the state is too weak to stop them, they get involved in trafficking humans, drugs, and arms, money laundering, and of course violence. It's funny since this is the roots of a lot of how these elites operate and gain their wealth and power. But in the future, it's just going to be so out in the open and obvious, and no one can do anything about it. The next section, he's going to talk about hyper-nomads. And so he calls the people that run these global corporations hyper-nomads. He says they are our new hyperclass. As he describes them, they sound like the worst kind of person you could possibly imagine. Basically atomistic, narcissistic, hedonistic, promiscuous, transhuman, drug addicts who get to live in private cities with private armies and who ignore any kids they may have. You know this shit's right around the corner. The next group of people are virtual nomads. He says the white-collar working class and skilled labor will have to be permanently monitored to stay employed. You'll have to travel constantly to find employment, which will not be long-term. Wages will still be driven down. He says the sedentary middle class will try to reject this nomadism. He says these classes will be virtual nomads. They will basically be obsessed with these self-monitors and want nothing but to be distracted. And then what he describes is getting into this like meta territory here. And apparently it seems that we're going to be going back to gladiator days and we're going to have blood sports. He says everyone will be mass drug consumers using their self-monitors. Pretty much a brave new world. And then you have infra-nomads, which are the lowest class, the untouchables, so to speak. And yes, with all this technology, we're still going to have mass poverty. He gets into the governance of this super empire, and he says we will have a market without a state. He basically compares this to Afghanistan in 2002. No state to protect equality or protect citizens, just a bunch of cartels just running shit. They can't have all this completely out of control to where cartels and pirates compete with the market. So the banks will install themselves as sovereign governmental bodies. No shit. Names the central banks that meet at Basel. Basically the BIS, as quickly told us, and the World Bank. They, of course, will use this to establish a global currency. And they're going to have private mercenaries to enforce this currency. He says impartial agencies will establish the norms for financial ecological, social, and ethical orthodoxy, which will influence behavior of businesses. So yeah, impartial agencies. That's funny. Essentially conform to these norms or you just can't function. They're going to use climate change as the justification. This is old hat to anyone studying this stuff. This is all your Green New Deal shit, but also mixed with your forced vaxxed and rainbow cult stuff. Again, they're going to use private forces to enforce everything since the government sector is too weak. So this is where you're getting your defund the police stuff from. Your local police are just usually people, within your communities that you go to church with and you shop at the grocery store with. These people are already refusing to go along with some of the crazy, BLM stuff that's going on in some of these small towns and especially in the red states. So they're going to want to replace your local police with privatized armies answerable only to global corporations. The next part, in the name of freedom, the end of freedom. Hyper-surveillance will end freedom. And because of climate change, travel will be restricted. Another conspiracy theory vindicated. But here again we have another possible contradiction, with him literally just saying you need to travel to stay employed. So perhaps travel will be just restricted to just public transport to home and work. He says we have maximized all frontiers. And in sort of like a Gnostic way, he says we will not tolerate being caged on this earth. The next frontier to conquer is man himself, what it means to be man. He says man will want to exit himself. He will present himself as an object in order to escape. And here he admits to what the critics of gender theory say, particularly the dissonant right. He says that sexuality is a constraint. It is the market, it is capital that seeks to separate sexuality from reproduction. Quote, in the 20th century, the mercantile order sought to evacuate the reproductive role of sexuality by making motherhood artificial, by using increasingly sophisticated methods, pills, premature labor, in vitro fertilization, surrogate mothers. In Super Empire, the mercantile order will even go so far as to dissociate reproduction and sexuality. Sexuality will be the kingdom of pleasure, reproduction that of the machines. End quote. So now you get the gender stuff. That it isn't some rejection of norms imposed by a capitalist society or whatever bullshit they tell themselves. It is an embrace of this future hyper-civilization ran by capital. It is a dive headfirst into what will be needed to bring in transhumanism, which he tells us in the end. So all the postmodern Marxist and feminist nonsense comes from capital. You aren't fighting the man by rejecting what it means to be a woman and your reproductive role in the species. You are adopting exactly what they want you to become a good little consumer. He says with reproduction being split from sex, it will go the way of machines. We will be able to create made-to-order babies, like artifacts. He says we're going to have artificial uteruses, which is like a really huge thing right now. They're starting to break ground on doing this. Of course, this being led and is a huge thing in the trans community. So you can see how they are being used as a vessel to normalize and bring this stuff about. I think this is one of the goals of the whole trans movement, with the whole men can have babies and can have periods and shit. Removing objective meaning to these terms in order to normalize artificial uterus and separating that aspect of sex and what it means to be a human being. And what does all this mean? It says it right here. The human being will thus have become a commercial object. And naturally, this leads to transhumanism and singularity. Quote, thanks to the astounding progress we can expect from the nanosciences, Everyone will even hope to transfer his awareness of himself to another body, to acquire his own double, copies of beloved people, dream men and women, hybrids built with particular traits, pre-selected to reach precise objectives. Some will even seek to overtake the human species with a life form endowed with a different and superior intelligence. End quote. There's a book by a leading trans person. It's called From Transgender to Transhuman by Martine Rothblatt, who even admits that the entire trans project, the entire goal of that project is transhumanism. He finishes by saying, "We will no longer know death because we will no longer be alive, like all industrial objects." Sounds fucking depressing. Chapter 5 is what he calls the second wave after the first wave of planetary empire. This is planetary war. And what he calls pirates, which are basically gangs, mafias, cartels, and terrorist movements, they will become agents of the elite. Remember that this is nothing new and has been common practice. He says basically in the absence of the state, gangs, cartels, etc. will run everything. And most of these are already tied into the CIA's network anyways. And hordes of infra-nomads, which remember were the untouchables, basically the poorest, will be a threat. And because of this, nations will need more in their ranks, and just like Rome, will add foreigners into its forces. He says USA already has over 300,000 non-citizens in their army. He says businesses will employ private armies like Blackwater, and even the United Nations will be protected by mercenaries. He says there are going to be anger of the secular. He foresees the anger of the people versus America in capital/anti-globalism. They will see the contradictions in the system. They will protest the surveillance dictatorship, and democracy will be denounced for the sham that it is. He says, quote, "The mercantile order will thus be justly accused of being for many a source of wretchedness, injustice, insecurity, disorder, waste, ecological upheavals, immorality, identity destruction, violation of religious rules, and oppression." He then seems to describe a situation like the movie Purge, where freedom from constraints will extend to the point of being able to freely kill with impunity. And if you haven't been advised by now, get out of massive cities. He says, quote, "The cities will become the principal nest of revolt. They will harbor more and more serial criminals. They will breed an infinity of killings." He says everyone who revolts against the system doesn't have an answer on how to replace it. And this is very true. He said communism has failed, which is also true, but in the sense of being a system that they created and tested. And he foresees even possibly the return of some form of theocracy, which leads into the next part, the anger of believers. And here he correctly identifies critiques from Christians. Quote, "The mercantile order represents the welcome and successful outcome of progress and individuality because in it, human freedom comes before God's commands, and particularly because it endangers the stability of the family on which transmission of faith depends." And then he says they will in particular oppose all forms of abortion, birth control, and of euthanasia. Now notice he says they will oppose abortion and birth control, but also euthanasia is lumped in there. Does this not imply euthanasia is seen as necessary or even a good if he is to point out that there is opposition to it? On this next page, he talks about the Catholic Church. I have some issues with the Catholic Church and the Vatican, but note he does admit it was a firewall to capitalism and to the merchant order before it was co-opted. But he does predict it will possibly return to its ways and attack liberal democracy. Yet to see that. He even believes there is a chance there will be a theocratic dictatorship coming from the Bible Belt. He goes on to say the church will speak out versus capitalism. I think this has all been accounted for, and a lot of churches have been corrupted. You can see rainbow flags hanging, and there are people saying goofy shit like Jesus would have taken the vax and nonsense like that. So I think they expected this, and I think they're trying to jump out in front of it and have done a pretty decent job of that. He says there will be sects like the Moon, Falun Gong, and notably Church of Scientology will develop thanks to the moral vacuum created by this super empire. The next section is weapons of hyper-conflict, and this should be obvious by now, but new technologies are developed by armies prior to bringing them into civilian market. Most of these future weapons are founded on the concept of surveillance. He says, quote, in the next 50 years, new technologies will be developed by armies before being used on the civilian market. For defense or police needs, governments will finance the research needed for perfection of the technologies of hypersurveillance and self-surveillance. In fact, these future weapons will essentially be founded on the concept of surveillance. Armies will at once develop digital infrastructures of nomadic ubiquity, surveillance systems for suspect movements, the means of protecting strategic installations, and a network of economic intelligence. He says there will be untraceable chemical weapons, pandemics, genetic weapons that target specific genes. All these are on the way. I think most of these are already here. Then he introduces something new he calls gray jelly, which is nanorobot dust that attack the cells. And also, kamikaze animals will be used. This isn't solely developed by military, he admits, but by global corporations. He says all state and non-state actors, pirates and terrorists, will have access to these, and he says cities and mass transport will be the targets. I think we're already starting to see this, but apparently it's going to get way worse. And once again, get out of cities. He says in the next section, with all this violence, the market needs to protect itself, naturally. So it is the U.S.'s role to modernize weapon systems, describing this satellite network that is equipped with a digital planetary infrastructure. I think this is your Internet of Things and your 5G being built. He says they will create a private international army led by NATO and includes global corporations to fight pirates. And eventually this army will only protect the interest of the elite. You will be on your own, Chief. He talks about this digital passport being necessary to leave the third world and enter the market using detailed information. This reminds me of a Black Mirror episode when everyone has like cameras in their eyes and records everything they do, and they have to play back their last 48 hours or whatever just to get through, TSA to get on a plane. He says there's going to be 4 kinds of conflicts that will erupt prior to hyper-conflict. Wars triggered by scarcity, the frontier, influence, and between pirates and sedentaries. He says we're going to have wars over clean water and fuel, a la Mad Max. He said frontier wars are going to lead to genocides. He said pirates are attacking everything, and not just by sea, but planes, trucks, trains, etc. You can think of like the movie Demolition Man. And we are already seeing like wholesale stealing from trains and such. You can find these videos all over Twitter. It's wild. He says pirates will use all the same weapons of the corporations, and suicide bombers are going to be a major problem by these pirates. He says to combat this, the merchants will transform the defense military alliance into a world police. Didn't he just say that the pirates will actually be in league with the elite just a few pages ago? So you can see the problem, reaction, solution here. And then he says civilians will be the collateral damage in all of this. And now we get into hyper-conflict. Essentially, every type of fight between all the different types of interests, like religion, pirates, terrorists, mercenaries, ideology, religion, political, economical, complete and total war. A total war in which every type of weapon can and will be used. And after everything is burnt to the ground, as most Masonic writings go, it is necessary to destroy everything and burn it to the ground in order to rebuild or have a rebirth. The growth of this super empire is for this reason. It must grow out of control, lead to hyper-conflict and global wars and wars over resources until people are tired of it and beg for a new global unity to end it all. This is definitely not a new concept that Attali is describing, but it does show that this is the plan. And then we get hyper-democracy. He says, to start chapter 6, this third wave is planetary democracy. He says we need this planetary democracy so we don't go extinct, and even admits that they have been working underground to lay its foundations. A conspiracy, if you will. He says, quote, a few of the catastrophes already foreseen will demonstrate crudely to the most skeptical that our present way of life cannot last. Climatic upheavals, increasing obesity, and the use of drugs, the stranglehold of violence on daily life, more and more terrifying acts of terrorists, the impossible gated seclusion of the wealthy, the mediocrity of our entertainments, the dictatorship of insurance companies, the invasion of time by market goods, the scarcity of water and oil, the rise of urban delinquency, the increasing frequency of financial crises, waves of immigrants wash ashore on our beaches, first with outstretched hands, then with raised fists, increasingly murderous and selective technologies, the moral bankruptcy of the wealthiest will one day come along to wake the deepest sleepers. Once more, disasters will be the most eloquent advocates for change. As at the end of any great war, people would then speak once again of drawing lessons from the past, of forgiving without forgetting, of building a different world, of doing away with violence forever. People of every social condition, of all cultures and religious affiliations, will ponder the possibilities for humanity's long-term survival. They will realize that neither super empire nor hyper-conflict can create a world built to last. Political plans will spring forth from everywhere for settling border disputes, reconciling manifold national claims within the same territory, and teaching people how to live serenely with themselves and others. End quote. If it seems like we have a face of an elite that are openly degenerate, corrupt, and incompetent, constantly overstepping, almost as if they're trying to break everything they touch on purpose, I believe it is because that is indeed what the plan is. Attali hints that this is inevitable and necessary. This is why we have Bidens and Trudeaus and Merkels of the world. They are the face of this collapse, so that those underground can come to save the day. He says the leaders of this new planetary democracy will be what he calls transhumans. Told you. And they will and are already running what he calls relational enterprises, which aren't profit-driven allegedly. What is a relational enterprise? It is a change from the old model of one-off transactions, of bringing mass-produced products to a consumer, to a subscription-based economy where you have to pay monthly to use services. This includes using the data gained from tracking and tracing everything you do to know you more than you know yourself. I have a nice little article here on medium.com about the future relational economy and what's it all about. And he has this handy dandy little illustration here to show the old model and now the new model with you as the subscriber and no longer the owner. And here's a couple little quotes from the author here. This little part is titled From Products to Services, as Attali said, from transactions to relationships, service level agreements. This is a quote of a quote, but he says they're calling this the age of the customer, or you could just call that consumer, and explores how this involves a shift from the old linear flow business model of products through channels to customers to a new cyclical flow business model that puts the customer at the center, surrounded by a customer journey cycle of interactions. He says this guy describes the thought experiments his team did in the early days of Zora, thinking about what the limits of subscriptions might be. Could you apply it to refrigerators, floors, elevators, roofs? Quote, here's the secret we use to answer all of them in the affirmative. Tease out the service level agreement that sits behind the product. It works for everything. So instead of a refrigerator, it's the guarantee of fresh, cold food. End quote. Then there's this other little part, quoting a book where they're looking ahead, and he says that the next step is a sharper, deeper, and more cooperative focus on the value of experiences. If you read through this reads very similar to Changing Images of Man document. And so essentially this is your World Economic Forum's you will own nothing and be happy. You're no longer going to own your refrigerator. You're going to have a subscription to cold food. Think about that shit. Anyways, so he talks about the vanguards of this hyper-democracy, and they are transhumans. He talks about this innovative class only concerned with humanity and says that it's going to be the transhumans. And of course, women are going to be transhumans easier than men. Even says among today's women, he names Melinda Gates. Interesting name. And then, of course, the altruistic billionaires that hide their money in tax-exempt foundations to use for their geopolitical purposes, well, they're transhumans too. Now, the point has been made by guys like Charles Galton Darwin and H.G. Wells in their books that their concern for the future and the human race doesn't include us. It is a concern for their class and their progeny to go safely into the future. They see people like us as a threat to that. So when they say, when they frame the word humanity, they mean for them. And so here he goes on to describe this new relational economy. And then he describes relational businesses. These businesses include the World Wildlife Fund, the Red Cross, which if you don't understand why that's funny, read Anthony Sutton. And laughably, he actually names the NGOs. He says these relational enterprises are already making up an international community, and new ones will appear in urban management, education, health, environment, women's rights, food, and monitoring the monitors. And he says they will take the place of private enterprises and public services. He says these relational enterprises will make up a new economy. This is your Great Reset. So altogether, what did he just say? He is saying that altruistic NGOs ran by female transhumans are going to replace private enterprises and public services. They're going to create a new relational economy to replace the market. This will bring in all the poor of the world into this international community that he just said is steps away from a world government. In other words, he is using flowery language to say that this elite class will be in charge of all the world's resources and we won't need an actual economy because we're going to have a social credit system. The next section is institutions of this hyperdemocracy. He says by 2100, we will all be forced to live in these mega smart cities where everything is interconnected. that we're all going to have UBS, and of course the world will be borderless. He says even our politicians are going to be tracked and traced. He expects there to be a bunch of European unions, which he says is a standard bearer of hyperdemocracy. He says the UN Charter will be extended to a constitution for the planet. The UN General Assembly, which will include more states, will enforce carbon taxes on each of the member states. The UN will merge with the G8 and serve as the executive body of a planetary government. So here we have another boomer conspiracy theory ending up being confirmed. He says this world government will dictate social norms and impose them on world businesses and give itself the means to make them respect it. This will consume the World Trade Organization under its trusteeship. This world government will have what he calls blue jelly, not the gray jelly, but a blue jelly, a nanobot weapon that can destroy the biomass. He says that it's needed to combat the gray jelly he described earlier that pirates are going to be using. To support this world government, they need new organs for control and regulation, which will be by those relational enterprises. Oh, so now we get the real reason and purpose for these relational altruistic enterprises. And naturally, he says we need a central world bank and a one global currency. Again, these damn boomer conspiracy theories. And so all of the ills led by having a market democracy and super empire will lead to this global governments to fix all these problems they caused. And what is the collective result of hyper democracy? The common good and universal intelligence. The ultimate objective, he says, is like H.G. Wells's world brain and the creation of artificial intelligence. He said it's going to be a collective golem. And of course, he ties this into evolution as the ultimate stage of evolution, which inevitably leads to merging man with this universal intelligence AI. In other words, real transhumanism and the singularity. But not for you, for them.